February 1st, 1997, 9:30 in the morning, Tampa, Florida. And James Edenfield is driving through streets he's known his whole life with a feeling in his gut that won't go away. That sick twist of dread that every instinct is telling him means something terrible has happened. His brother Stephen didn't show up to their mother's house this morning, and that's not like Stephen at all. Stephen is reliable. Stephen is the one who takes care of Mom. Makes her breakfast every morning, checks on her, makes sure she's okay, especially now after she just got released from the hospital yesterday following a stroke. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James has been calling Stephen's phone all morning and getting nothing. No answer, no call back, just silence. And that silence is getting louder and more ominous with every mile he drives toward the Tampa Racket Club condominium complex where his 41-year-old brother lives alone. The sun is already climbing in that Florida sky. The kind of bright, cheerful morning that makes what's about to happen seem even more impossible, even more wrong, and James pulls into the complex, parks his car, walks up to Stephen's unit, and the first thing he notices is the door is closed, but when he tries the handle it's unlocked, and that's wrong too, because Stephen always locks his door. Always, it's automatic, it's habit. So why would the door be unlocked at 9:30 in the morning? James pushes the door open slowly, calls out his brother's name, "Stephen, you here, Stephen?" And the silence that comes back is not the silence of an empty apartment. It's something else, something heavy and thick and suffocating. He takes a step inside, and immediately his brain starts processing details it doesn't want to process. Blood on the floor. Not a little bit of blood, but enough to know someone got hurt badly. Pieces of what looks like a broken statue scattered across the hallway. Furniture knocked over. Obvious signs of a violent struggle. The kind of chaos that happens when someone is fighting for their life. James's heart is hammering in his chest now. His hands are shaking, and every nerve in his body is screaming at him to turn around and run, but he can't. He has to know. He has to find Stephen. So he keeps moving forward through the hallway toward the bedroom, and with every step he's praying, please let him be okay. Please let this be something else, anything else. But when he reaches the bedroom doorway and looks inside, he sees his brother Stephen lying in bed under a blanket. And even from the doorway, James can see the blood. So much blood soaked into the sheets, soaked into the blanket. And Stephen's skin has that waxy pale color that James has never seen on a living person. He moves closer, reaches out to touch his brother, and Stephen is cold, completely cold, the kind of cold that means he's been dead for hours. And James stumbles backward, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes are seeing. And then he notices something else that makes his blood turn to ice. There on Stephen's bedroom wall, written in what can only be Stephen's own blood, is a single word in large letters: greed. James runs from the apartment, his legs barely holding him up, gets to the front office of the complex, and somehow manages to dial 911. "My brother, you have to come. My brother is dead. Someone killed my brother." And the dispatcher is asking him questions, but James can barely hear her over the roaring in his ears, the world tilting sideways, his whole reality shattering into pieces because just 12 hours ago he was having dinner with Stephen, and everything was fine, everything was normal. And now Stephen is dead, and someone wrote greed on his wall in his blood, and nothing will ever be normal again. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputies arrive within minutes, multiple units with lights flashing, and they secure the scene, keep James outside, start the methodical process of documenting what is very clearly a homicide. When the lead detective arrives and enters Stephen Edenfield's bedroom, he sees immediately that this wasn't a quick killing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was rage. This was intimate violence between people who knew each other. Stephen Edenfield is lying on his back in bed, his face and head showing signs of severe blunt force trauma. And when the medical examiner arrives and examines the body, they find multiple stab wounds, defensive wounds on his hands and arms, where he tried to protect himself. Injuries that tell the story of someone who fought hard to stay alive, who struggled against his attacker, who died slowly and painfully in his own bedroom. The crime scene technicians photograph everything, collect blood samples from multiple locations, bag evidence, dust for fingerprints. And they find blood on a tank top in the bedroom, blood on socks in the living room, blood spatter patterns that will help them reconstruct what happened. But what they don't find is any sign of forced entry. The door was unlocked when James arrived. There's no broken windows, no jimmied locks, which means Stephen Edenfield opened his door and let his killer inside, which means he knew them, probably trusted them, had no reason to be afraid when they walked into his home. The detectives start building a timeline, talking to neighbors, and they learn that Stephen was alive at 11:30 the night before because that's when he left the complex. Went somewhere, neighbors don't know where, and then he came back just before 1 in the morning. The security guard on duty that night remembers it clearly because Stephen drove up to the gate and had forgotten his remote control. So the guard came out to manually open the gate. And Stephen said something that in retrospect becomes crucial evidence. He told the guard that the car behind him was also with him, that they were together. So the guard let both vehicles through without getting a good look at the second driver. Didn't ask for ID, didn't write down a license plate number, just waved them through because Stephen said it was okay. That means the killer followed Stephen home from wherever he'd been that night. Followed him right through the security gate with Stephen's permission. And within 60 minutes, neighbors in surrounding units started hearing violence. Sounds of a struggle, what might have been someone calling for help. But nobody called the police. Nobody checked on Stephen. Because it's 1 in the morning, and people convince themselves it's nothing. It's a loud TV, it's a domestic argument, it'll stop on its own. And by the time anyone realizes something terrible happened, it's too late. The detectives work the case hard in those first crucial hours and days. They interview Stephen's family, his friends, his co-workers, anyone who might know why someone would want him dead, what that word greed written on the wall means, whether Stephen had money problems, business disputes, romantic entanglements, anything that might explain this level of violence. James tells them that Stephen had dinner with him and their sister the night of January 31st. Just a normal family dinner at their mother's house. Their mother, who had just been released from the hospital that same day after suffering a stroke. And Stephen seemed fine, seemed happy, seemed like himself. Gave no indication that anything was wrong or that he was afraid of anyone. After dinner, Stephen went home, and later that night he left again around 11:30. And James doesn't know where Stephen went or who he met up with. That's the missing piece. Those few hours between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. when Stephen was somewhere with someone who would end up killing him. The detectives collect DNA evidence from the scene. They swab blood from the tank top, from the socks, from various locations in the apartment. And in 1997, DNA testing is still relatively new technology. They can extract a profile. They can determine that some of the blood doesn't belong to Stephen Edenfield, that it belongs to his killer, but without a suspect to compare it to. Without someone already in the system whose DNA matches, that evidence just sits in storage waiting for science to catch up, waiting for the day when they'll be able to do something with it. Weeks turn into months, months turn into years, leads dry up, witnesses move away or die. The case gets moved from active investigation to cold case status, and the Edenfield family is left with nothing but questions that have no answers, rage that has no target, and grief that can't find closure because somewhere out there Stephen's killer is walking around free. Let's talk about what cold cases really mean, because the term is misleading. Cold case sounds like something frozen, something stopped, something that doesn't matter anymore. But for the families left behind, there is nothing cold about it. These cases burn hot every single day for decades. James Edenfield wakes up every morning for 28 years, And before his feet even hit the floor, he's thinking about his brother Stephen, about finding him dead in that bed, about the word greed on the wall, about the killer who is still out there somewhere living their life while Stephen is buried in the Garden of Memories cemetery. The pain doesn't fade, it doesn't get easier with time. It actually gets worse because every year that passes is another year without justice. Another year of watching the legal system fail you. Another year of seeing other families get closure while you get nothing. Their mother tries so hard to hang on, tries to survive long enough to know who killed her son. And you have to understand the context here. She'd just been released from the hospital the day before Stephen was murdered. She'd had a stroke. She was vulnerable and weak and needed care. And Stephen was the one taking care of her. Stephen was making her breakfast every morning, checking on her multiple times a day, being the dutiful son, and then suddenly he's gone. Suddenly he's murdered in the most brutal way possible, and she's left wondering what she did to deserve this. Why her son? Why her family? She lives with that question burning in her mind for 6 years. 6 years of hoping every time the phone rings that it's the police calling to say they've made an arrest. They found him, it's over, but the call never comes. She dies in 2003, buried next to Stephen in the same cemetery, and James stands at her graveside, knowing that she died without answers, died without peace, died still wondering who killed her boy. And that knowledge is its own kind of torture. Their sister Deborah is diagnosed with brain cancer, and as she's going through treatment, losing her hair, getting weaker, she asks James the same question their mother asked. Have they caught him yet? Do they know who did it? And James has to tell her no. Not yet, we're still waiting, keep fighting, stay alive. Maybe you'll see justice before the end. But she doesn't, she dies too, without ever knowing. Their other sister, Catherine, develops kidney failure, her body slowly shutting down, and she asks the same question. Has anyone been arrested? Is there any news? And again the answer is no, still no, always no, and she dies as well. One by one, the Edenfield family members who loved Stephen, who were there that last night at dinner when everything was normal, they all die waiting for justice that never comes. Until finally James is the last one left, the sole survivor, the only person from the immediate family still alive and still carrying this burden, still praying every night for answers, still hoping that somehow before he dies, too, someone will finally be held accountable for murdering his brother. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James gives up hope, really. How could he not? 20 years pass, then 25. And he's watching true crime shows where cases get solved and thinking, why not Stephen's case? Why not our family? What makes us less deserving of closure than anyone else? He's reading articles about advances in DNA technology, about genetic genealogy, about cold cases being solved decades later. And part of him wonders if maybe, possibly someday. But another part of him has accepted that it's never going to happen. That whoever killed Stephen has successfully gotten away with murder. That justice is a lie we tell ourselves to feel better about a random and cruel world. What James doesn't know is that in 2022, 25 years after his brother's murder, someone at the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office is making a decision that will change everything. A cold case detective is pulling Stephen Edenfield's file, looking at the evidence that's been sitting in storage for a quarter century, and thinking we have DNA, we have technology now that didn't exist in 1997. Maybe we can finally solve this. The Sheriff's Office has a dedicated cold case unit now. Detectives who specialize in exactly these kinds of investigations, who understand that advances in forensic science have made previously unsolvable cases suddenly solvable. And they've been working with a company called Othram Labs in Texas that's been cracking impossible cases using cutting-edge genetic genealogy techniques. Genetic genealogy is the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer in California, that solved dozens of cold cases across the country. Cases where detectives had DNA from the killer, but no match in the criminal database. Cases that seemed hopeless until scientists figured out they could upload that DNA to public genealogy databases and find relatives of the killer. Distant cousins who'd done their own DNA tests for ancestry purposes and never imagined their genetic information would help catch a murderer. The way it works is complex but brilliant. They take the killer's DNA profile and run it through these databases looking for matches. Not exact matches, but partial matches that indicate family relationships, and then they build a family tree, working backward from those distant relatives to figure out who the unknown killer might be, based on age, location, other demographic factors. It's painstaking work. It takes months sometimes. It requires genealogists who can track down records, build massive family trees with thousands of individuals, narrow down possibilities until they land on a suspect. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office cold case detectives reach out to Othram Labs and say, "We have this 1997 murder. We have DNA evidence from the scene that doesn't match the victim. We think it belongs to the killer. Can you help us?" And Othram says, "Yes, we can try. Send us the evidence." The detectives pull everything from. The detectives start building a timeline, talking to neighbors. And they learn that Stephen was alive at 11:30 the night before, because that's when he left the complex. Went somewhere, neighbors don't know where, and then he came back just before 1 in the morning. The security guard on duty that night remembers it clearly, because Stephen drove up to the gate and had forgotten his remote control. So the guard came out to manually open the gate, and Stephen said something that in retrospect becomes crucial evidence. He told the guard that the car behind him was also with him, that they were together. So the guard let both vehicles through without getting a good look at the second driver. Didn't ask for ID, didn't write down a license plate number, just waved them through because Stephen said it was okay. That means the killer followed Stephen home from wherever he'd been that night, followed him right through the security gate with Stephen's permission. And within 60 minutes, neighbors in surrounding units started hearing violence, sounds of a struggle, what might have been someone calling for help. But nobody called the police, nobody checked on Stephen, because it's 1 in the morning and people convince themselves it's nothing. It's a loud TV, it's a domestic argument. It'll stop on its own, and by the time anyone realizes something terrible happened, it's too late. The detectives work the case hard in those first crucial hours and days. They interview Stephen's family, his friends, his co-workers, anyone who might know why someone would want him dead. What that word greed written on the wall means, whether Stephen had money problems, business disputes, romantic entanglements, anything that might explain this level of violence. James tells them that Stephen had dinner with him and their sister the night of January 31st. Just a normal family dinner at their mother's house. Their mother, who had just been released from the hospital that same day after suffering a stroke. And Stephen seemed fine, seemed happy, seemed like himself. Gave no indication that anything was wrong or that he was afraid of anyone. After dinner, Stephen went home, and later that night he left again around 11:30. And James doesn't know where Stephen went or who he met up with. That's the missing piece. Those few hours between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. when Stephen was somewhere with someone who would end up killing him. The detectives collect DNA evidence from the scene. They swab blood from the tank top, from the socks, from various locations in the apartment. And in 1997, DNA testing is still relatively new technology. They can extract a profile. They can determine that some of the blood doesn't belong to Stephen Edenfield, that it belongs to his killer, but without a suspect to compare it to. Without someone already in the system whose DNA matches. That evidence just sits in storage waiting for science to catch up, waiting for the day when they'll be able to do something with it. Weeks turn into months, months turn into years, leads dry up, witnesses move away or die. The case gets moved from active investigation to cold case status. And the Edenfield family is left with nothing but questions that have no answers, rage that has no target, and grief that can't find closure because somewhere out there, Stephen's killer is walking around free. Let's talk about what cold cases really mean, because the term is misleading. Cold case sounds like something frozen, something stopped, something that doesn't matter anymore. But for the families left behind, there is nothing cold about it. These cases burn hot every single day for decades. James Edenfield wakes up every morning for 28 years, and before his feet even hit the floor, he's thinking about his brother Stephen, about finding him dead in that bed, about the word greed on the wall, about the killer who is still out there somewhere living their life, while Stephen is buried in the Garden of Memories cemetery. The pain doesn't fade. It doesn't get easier with time. It actually gets worse, because every year that passes is another year without justice. Another year of watching the legal system fail you. Another year of seeing other families get closure while you get nothing. Their mother tries so hard to hang on, tries to survive long enough to know who killed her son. And you have to understand the context here. She'd just been released from the hospital the day before Stephen was murdered. She'd had a stroke. She was vulnerable and weak and needed care. And Stephen was the one taking care of her. Stephen was making her breakfast every morning, checking on her multiple times a day, being the dutiful son, and then suddenly he's gone. Suddenly he's murdered in the most brutal way possible. And she's left wondering what she did to deserve this. Why her son? Why her family? She lives with that question burning in her mind for 6 years. 6 years of hoping every time the phone rings that it's the police calling to say they've made an arrest. They found him, it's over, but the call never comes. She dies in 2003, buried next to Stephen in the same cemetery, and James stands at her graveside, knowing that she died without answers, died without peace, died still wondering who killed her boy. And that knowledge is its own kind of torture. Their sister Deborah is diagnosed with brain cancer, and as she's going through treatment, losing her hair, getting weaker, she asks James the same question their mother asked. Have they caught him yet? Do they know who did it? And James has to tell her no. Not yet, we're still waiting, keep fighting, stay alive. Maybe you'll see justice before the end. But she doesn't, she dies too without ever knowing. Their other sister Catherine develops kidney failure, her body slowly shutting down, and she asks the same question. Has anyone been arrested? Is there any news? And again, the answer is no, still no, always no, and she dies as well. One by one, the Edenfield family members who loved Stephen, who were there that last night at dinner when everything was normal, they all die waiting for justice that never comes. Until finally James is the last one left, the sole survivor. The only person from the immediate family still alive and still carrying this burden, still praying every night for answers, still hoping that somehow before he dies too, someone will finally be held accountable for murdering his brother. Storage, the bloody tank top that was found in Stephen Edenfield's bedroom, the socks from the living room, items that have been sitting in an evidence locker for 25 years. And they ship it to Texas, where scientists will attempt to extract viable DNA from degraded samples, a process that requires sophisticated techniques that didn't exist when this evidence was first collected. Courtroom Labs specializes in something called forensic-grade genome sequencing, which sounds like science fiction, but is very real. They can take tiny amounts of degraded DNA that traditional testing methods can't work with, and build comprehensive genetic profiles that can be used for genealogical research. The scientists receive the evidence from the Edenfield case, and they get to work, extracting DNA, sequencing it, building a profile, and what they find is exactly what the cold case detectives hoped for. There is unknown male DNA on that tank top, DNA that doesn't belong to Stephen Edenfield. DNA that almost certainly belongs to his killer. The funding for all this advanced testing comes from a Bureau of Justice Assistance grant, because this kind of work is expensive. It costs thousands of dollars per case, and local sheriff's offices don't always have the budget for it. But there are federal grants available specifically to help solve cold cases, to give families like the Edenfields the answers they've been waiting for. Once Courtroom has the DNA profile, they hand it off to their in-house forensic genetic genealogy team. experts who will upload this data to public genealogy databases and start looking for relatives of the unknown killer. This part of the process can take months because they're not looking for an exact match. They're looking for people who share enough DNA with the killer to indicate they're related. Maybe second cousins, third cousins, distant relatives who share a common ancestor. And then they have to build family trees for all these people. Figure out how they're connected, trace lineages back generations to find common ancestors. Then work forward through time to identify which branch of the family tree might contain their suspect. It's detective work combined with genealogical research. It's hours spent poring over birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census data, military records, any documentation that helps piece together how families are connected. And somewhere in all that data is the name of Stephen Edenfield's killer. They just have to find it. But here's where the case takes an unexpected turn that makes everything happen much faster than anyone anticipated. The cold case detectives decide to take that unknown DNA profile and enter it into CODIS, which is the FBI's combined DNA index system, a massive database that contains DNA profiles from millions of criminals and crime scenes across America. And they're not really expecting a hit, because if this killer's DNA was in CODIS, they would have found him decades ago. But they run it anyway because you never know. And in January 2024, the system comes back with results that make the detectives sit up straight in their chairs. They have a match, January 10th, 2024, 27 years after Stephen Edenfield was murdered in his Tampa bedroom, and the DNA profile from his case hits a match in CODIS. But it's not a match to a criminal already in the system. It's a match to DNA from another crime scene, an unsolved sexual assault case from 2005 in Waukegan, Illinois. And suddenly the cold case detectives realize they're dealing with someone who has attacked multiple people, someone who has been leaving DNA evidence at crime scenes for decades, someone who clearly never thought they'd be caught. The Illinois case from 2005 already had a suspect identified. Investigators up there had narrowed it down to a specific individual, but they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest. Couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that their suspect was the perpetrator. So the case sat unsolved, but they had the suspect's name in their files. Brandon Gliha. The Hillsborough County cold case detectives are now staring at this information. At this name, Brandon Gliha, and they start running background checks, looking at where he lives, where he's been, whether he has any connection to Tampa, to Stephen Edenfield, to that night in February 1997, and what they discover makes their blood run cold. Brandon Gliha lives in Tampa, has lived there for years, possibly has been living there since right after Stephen's murder, which means he's been in the same city as James Edenfield all this time, possibly driving past the Tampa Racket Club complex where he committed murder, shopping at the same stores, eating at the same restaurants, living a normal life, while the Edenfield family suffered through nearly 3 decades of grief and unanswered questions. The detectives know they're onto something huge, but they also know they have to be careful. They can't arrest Brandon Gliha based solely on the DNA match to the Illinois case. They need direct evidence linking him to Stephen Edenfield's murder. They need his DNA to compare against the samples from that tank top and those socks. And that means they need to collect a sample from Brandon Gliha without him knowing what they're doing, because the last thing they want is for him to lawyer up or disappear before they can build a solid case. On January 22, 2025, detectives conduct what's called a surreptitious DNA collection, which means they follow Brandon Gliha, watch him from a distance, wait for him to discard something that might contain his DNA, a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a napkin, anything he's touched that he throws away in a public place where it's legally considered abandoned property that police can collect without a warrant. They get what they need, whatever item Brandon Gliha discarded that day. They bag it carefully to preserve the DNA. They send it to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Laboratory for analysis, and then they wait. And waiting is the hardest part because they're so close now. So close to finally solving a 28-year-old murder. But they need confirmation. They need absolute certainty that Brandon Gliha is their guy. 9 days later, January 31st, 2025, the lab results come back, and the cold case detectives are reading the report with hands shaking because it's a match. Brandon Gliha's DNA matches the unknown DNA found on the tank top from Stephen Edenfield's bedroom. The DNA that's been sitting in evidence storage for 28 years. And suddenly, after all this time, they know who killed Stephen. They have scientific proof, they have a suspect, they have a case. But before they can arrest Brandon Gliha specifically for the Tampa murder, something unexpected happens that actually works in the investigators' favor. On February 5th, 2025, just days after the DNA confirmation, Brandon Gliha is arrested on a completely unrelated warrant out of Illinois. Some old forgery charge he's been dodging, and it catches up with him at exactly the right moment. He's taken into custody, and during the standard booking process, deputies collect an official DNA sample, a cheek swab that will be entered into the system, and that sample is also sent for testing. And when those results come back, they show that Brandon Gliha's DNA also matches the DNA found on the socks from Stephen Edenfield's living room, which means his DNA is in multiple locations throughout the crime scene, which destroys any possible defense argument that maybe he was there innocently, that maybe he'd visited Stephen earlier, and that's why his DNA is present. Because why would his DNA be on bloody socks in the living room, on a bloody tank top in the bedroom, unless he was there during the murder, unless he's the one who killed Stephen Edenfield? The cold case detectives now have Brandon Gliha exactly where they want him. He's in custody on the Illinois warrant. He has no idea that they're about to hit him with a murder charge, and they arrange to interview him, to sit him down in an interrogation room and lay out the evidence they've been building for the past year. The interview happens at a police facility, and we don't know exactly what was said in that room, what tactics the detectives used, whether they showed Brandon Gliha the DNA evidence immediately or whether they tried to get him to confess first. But what we do know is the outcome. Brandon Gliha, 47 years old, after 28 years of living free, of thinking he'd gotten away with murder, confesses. He admits to killing Stephen Edenfield. He tells the detectives, "Yes, I did it. I was there that night. I killed him." The confession is critical because even with DNA evidence, defense attorneys can sometimes create reasonable doubt. They can argue contamination. They can argue the DNA got there some other way. They can muddy the waters enough to make a jury uncertain. But when you have a confession combined with DNA evidence, you have an incredibly strong case. You have a case that's basically impossible to defend against. We don't know the details of what Brandon Gliha said about that night in February 1997. We don't know if he explained why he killed Stephen. Whether it really was about greed like the word on the wall suggested, whether it was a robbery gone wrong, whether it was something personal between them, whether they knew each other before that night, or whether they met just hours before the murder. The sheriff's office hasn't released those specifics and probably won't until the trial. What we do know is that on February 24, 2025, the Hillsborough State Attorney's Office formally charges Brandon Gliha with murder in the first degree with a weapon, specifically premeditated murder, which is the most serious murder charge possible. And they also charge him with robbery with a deadly weapon. And he's being held without bond because he's a flight risk. Because he's already been running from an Illinois warrant. Because he's facing life in prison or potentially the death penalty. Before the sheriff's office announces the arrest publicly, they make a decision that shows real compassion for what the Edenfield family has been through. They decide to notify James Edenfield personally before the news breaks, to give him the dignity of hearing it from detectives in person rather than from a news report or a phone call. 2 cold case detectives drive to James Edenfield's home in Tampa. They knock on his door, and when he opens it, he has no idea that his life is about to change. That the prayers he's been saying every single night for 28 years are about to be answered. That the waiting is finally over. The detectives tell him, we've made an arrest in your brother's murder. We have DNA evidence. We have a confession. The suspect is Brandon Gliha, and he's in custody, and he's been charged. And James Edenfield, 72 years old, the last surviving member of his immediate family. The man who found his brother's body all those years ago. He breaks down because it's real. It's finally real. Someone is being held accountable. Later, James will tell reporters that he was shocked because he wasn't expecting it to happen in his lifetime. He'd given up hope, but he also says what goes around comes around. And you can hear in his voice this mixture of relief and grief and anger all tangled together. Because yes, finally there's justice, but it doesn't bring Stephen back. It doesn't give him back the 28 years his mother spent dying without answers. It doesn't resurrect his sisters who died still wondering who killed their brother. Justice is important, justice matters, but justice is also cold comfort when you've lost so much. When you've spent nearly 3 decades in limbo, when you've had to bury multiple family members who never got to see this day. Sheriff Chad Chronister holds a press conference at the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office headquarters, stands in front of the cameras and microphones, and says for 28 years, Stephen Edenfield's family has waited for answers. Today, we can finally give them some measure of peace. No family should have to endure this kind of pain for so long. While nothing can erase the loss they've suffered, we hope knowing that justice has been served brings them comfort. And standing behind him are the cold case detectives who worked this case, who spent months following leads, coordinating with Othram Labs, building the family trees, tracking down Brandon Gliha, building a case strong enough to get a confession. Let's talk about who Stephen Edenfield was before he became a murder victim. Before his name became attached to a cold case, before his death defined his identity. Because he was a real person with a real life and people who loved him. Stephen was 41 years old when he died, single, living alone in that Tampa Racket Club condo. And by all accounts, he was a good man, a caring son, a devoted brother, the kind of person who showed up for family, who took care of his mother, especially after she had that stroke, who made breakfast for her every morning without being asked, who checked on her multiple times a day just to make sure she was okay. His brother James described him as reliable, as someone you could count on. And that reliability is actually part of what makes his murder so shocking. Because when someone like that suddenly doesn't show up, when they break their routine, when they miss that breakfast appointment, you know immediately something is terribly wrong. The night before he died, January 31st, 1997, Stephen had dinner with James and their sister. Just a normal family meal at their mother's house, nothing unusual. Nothing that would make you think this would be the last time they'd see Stephen alive. And after dinner, Stephen went home to his condo, and the family assumed they'd see him again the next morning, assumed life would continue as normal, assumed they had all the time in the world. But Stephen left his condo again around 11:30 that night, went somewhere, met someone, and we still don't know all the details about those missing hours between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. when he returned to the complex with another car following him. Where did Stephen go that night? Did he go to a bar, to a friend's house? Did he have plans with someone specific? Or did he meet Brandon Gliha randomly somewhere? And if it was random, if they met by chance that night, what happened in those few hours that ended with Brandon Gliha following Stephen home and murdering him in his bedroom? The word greed, written on the wall in Stephen's blood, suggests a motive related to money, suggests that Brandon Gliha believed Stephen had something worth stealing. Or maybe Stephen discovered something about Brandon Gliha. Maybe there was a transaction that went wrong. Maybe Brandon Gliha owed Stephen money or vice versa. Maybe there was a drug deal or a gambling debt or some other financial entanglement that we don't know about yet. Or maybe the word greed wasn't written by Brandon Gliha at all. Maybe it was Stephen's dying act, his final communication to the world. His attempt to tell investigators why he was being killed, to identify his killer's motive, even as he was bleeding out in his own bed. The crime scene tells us a lot about what happened in those final minutes of Stephen's life. The broken statue pieces in the hallway indicate there was a struggle. Stephen fought back. He tried to defend himself. Maybe he grabbed that statue and used it as a weapon, or maybe Brandon Gliha grabbed it first and used it to beat Stephen. And the blood evidence shows movement through the apartment, shows that the violence didn't happen in just one location, that there was a fight that moved from room to room before ending in the bedroom where Stephen ultimately died. The medical examiner found multiple stab wounds, which tells us Brandon Gliha came prepared with a weapon or found one in Stephen's apartment, and the blunt force trauma suggests he used the statue or his fists or both. This was a frenzied attack. This was someone in a rage. This was personal violence, of the kind that happens when two people are in conflict, when there's emotion and anger and loss of control. The fact that there was no forced entry, that the door was unlocked when James arrived, suggests that Stephen opened the door for Brandon Gliha, let him inside willingly, probably had no reason to be afraid initially. Which means either they knew each other or Brandon Gliha was good at presenting a non-threatening persona, good at talking his way inside, good at making Stephen feel safe right up until the moment the violence started. Neighbors heard the violence starting around 1 a.m., heard what they described as sounds of a struggle, possibly someone calling for help. And this is one of the tragic aspects of this case. People heard what was happening and didn't call the police, didn't check on Stephen, convinced themselves it was nothing serious. And by the time morning came and James arrived to find his brother's body, it was too late. Stephen had been dead for hours. His killer was long gone. And any chance of catching Brandon Gliha in the immediate aftermath of the murder was lost. This speaks to a broader problem with how we respond to signs of domestic violence or violence in our communities. We hear things, we sense something is wrong, but we don't want to get involved. We don't want to be the person who calls the cops over what might turn out to be nothing. We don't want to be dramatic or overreactive. And so we convince ourselves everything is fine, and we go back to sleep, and sometimes people die because we didn't make that call. If someone had called the police at 1 a.m. when they heard the struggle, if deputies had responded and found Stephen still alive, or found Brandon Gliha still at the scene, this whole case would have been different. Stephen might have survived. Brandon Gliha would have been arrested immediately. The Edenfield family wouldn't have had to suffer through 28 years of waiting, but that's not what happened. The original investigation in 1997 was thorough. The detectives did everything they could with the tools they had at the time. They collected DNA evidence, which was still relatively new technology back then. They interviewed witnesses. They built timelines. They looked for suspects. But they hit a wall because the DNA didn't match anyone in the system. And without that match, they had no way to identify who the unknown DNA belonged to. The case file was thick with reports and evidence logs and witness statements, but it didn't have the one thing they needed most: a name. And eventually the case had to be moved from active investigation to cold case status because there were no more leads to follow, nowhere else to go. And the detectives working on it had to move on to other cases, while Stephen's murder remained unsolved. But the evidence was preserved. That's the critical thing. They kept those bloody clothes, those DNA samples. They stored them properly, so that decades later, when technology advanced enough to do something with them, when genetic genealogy became a viable investigative tool, the evidence would still be there, still be usable. And that's exactly what happened. This case is a testament to the importance of evidence preservation, to keeping cold cases open even when they seem hopeless, because you never know when science will advance enough to solve something that was previously unsolvable, specifics, and probably won't until the trial. The technology that caught Brandon Gliha, this forensic genetic genealogy, is revolutionizing cold case investigation across the country. There are hundreds of cases that have been solved in the past few years using these techniques. Cases that had been cold for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. Cases where families had given up hope, just like James Edenfield had given up hope. The Golden State Killer was caught this way in 2018. A serial rapist and murderer who terrorized California in the 70s and 80s, committed at least 13 murders and 50 rapes, and he was never caught despite massive investigations. But then investigators used genetic genealogy, uploaded his DNA to a public genealogy website, found distant relatives, built a family tree, and identified him as Joseph D'Angelo, a former police officer who had been living a quiet life, thinking he'd gotten away with it. Since then, the technique has been used to solve cases all over America, and what's particularly powerful about it is that it works even when the killer has no criminal record, even when their DNA isn't in CODIS, because it's finding them through their relatives, through people who have no idea their DNA test is helping solve crimes. And there's been some controversy about whether this violates privacy rights, whether police should be able to use these public databases this way. But most people agree that if it solves murders, if it brings justice to families who have been waiting decades, the privacy concerns are outweighed by the public good. Courtroom Labs, the company that did the DNA work on Stephen Edenfield's case, has been involved in solving hundreds of cases now, both identifying unknown victims and identifying unknown perpetrators. And they're funded partly by private donations, partly by grants like the Bureau of Justice Assistance grant that funded Stephen's case, and partly by law enforcement agencies that see the value in this work. The scientists at Courtroom can take DNA samples that other labs can't work with. Degraded samples, tiny samples, mixed samples where multiple people's DNA is combined. And they can extract usable profiles using this forensic-grade genome sequencing technology that's incredibly sophisticated. The cost per case is high, typically $10,000 to $15,000, which is why many cold cases still go unsolved, because local sheriff's offices don't have the budget. But there are grants available, and increasingly there are crowdfunding campaigns where families or communities raise money to pay for testing in specific cases they care about. This is the 39th case in Florida where Courtroom has helped identify a suspect or victim, which means there are at least 38 other families in Florida who have gotten answers they'd been waiting years for. And there are many more cases currently being worked. DNA being tested, family trees being built, suspects being identified, February 2025. And the news of Brandon Gleeha's arrest spreads through Tampa and beyond, making headlines across Florida and nationally. Because this case has everything that makes a cold case solve compelling. The decades of waiting, the family tragedy, the cutting-edge science, the confession, and people who have been following true crime, who understand how rare it is for a case this old to be solved. They're paying attention, they're reading every article, watching every news segment, trying to understand how this happened, how justice finally caught up with Brandon Gleeha after 28 years. James Edenfield does interviews with local news stations, and his pain is visible even through his relief. He talks about his brother, about his mother who died without answers, about his sisters who died without answers, about being the last one left to see this resolution. And when reporters ask him what he wants to happen to Brandon Gleeha if he's convicted, James surprises some people by saying he doesn't want the death penalty. Most people assume families of murder victims want the harshest possible punishment, want the person who killed their loved one to be executed. But James says no, death is too easy, too quick. I want Brandon Gleeha to rot behind bars. I want him to spend decades in prison thinking about what he did, experiencing the same kind of slow suffering we experienced. I want him to lose years of his life, the way Stephen lost his life, the way we lost 28 years waiting for justice. And there's something profound in that statement, something that speaks to a deeper understanding of what punishment means, what justice really looks like. Brandon Gleeha is being held in the Hillsborough County Jail without bond awaiting trial, and the charges he's facing are as serious as they get. First-degree premeditated murder with a weapon, which in Florida can carry either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty, and robbery with a deadly weapon which adds additional years to any sentence. The state attorney's office filed a motion to keep him in jail pending trial, laying out all the evidence they have. The DNA matches the confession, the timeline, the witness statements, everything they'll use to convict him. And reading through that motion, you understand why they're confident about getting a conviction. Because the evidence is overwhelming, because Brandon Gliha himself confessed, because there's no reasonable way for a defense attorney to argue innocence when your client's DNA is all over the crime scene and he's admitted to the murder. Of course, there will still be a trial. Brandon Gliha has the right to a trial, and his attorney will have to decide what strategy to pursue. Maybe argue for a lesser charge. Maybe argue that it was manslaughter rather than premeditated murder. Maybe claim self-defense or diminished capacity. But none of those defenses seem likely to succeed given the evidence, given the brutality of the attack, given that word greed on the wall that suggests motive. The trial will likely happen sometime in late 2025 or early 2026. And when it does, James Edenfield will be there in the courtroom. We'll have to sit through testimony about how his brother died. We'll have to look at crime scene photos. We'll have to hear details he probably doesn't want to know, but needs to know. And at the end of it all, a jury will decide Brandon Gliha's fate. Will decide whether he spends the rest of his life in prison or whether he faces execution. And either way, Stephen Edenfield will still be dead. The 28 years of suffering will still have happened. Justice will still be incomplete because justice in murder cases is always incomplete. You can punish the perpetrator, but you can't undo the crime. You can't bring back the victim. You can't give families back the years they lost. But justice still matters. Accountability still matters. The principle that you can't murder someone and get away with it still matters. And for James Edenfield, and for everyone who knew Stephen, this arrest, this confession, this upcoming trial represents a form of closure, represents an end to the uncertainty, represents validation that Stephen's life mattered enough for detectives to keep working the case, for scientists to develop new technologies, for the justice system to keep pursuing the truth no matter how long it takes. The broader implications of this case extend beyond just the Edenfield family. This is a demonstration of what's possible when law enforcement agencies invest in cold case investigations, when they utilize modern forensic technology, when they don't give up on victims just because years or decades have passed. Across Florida and across America, there are thousands of cold cases sitting in file cabinets and evidence lockers. Cases where families are still waiting for answers. Cases where DNA evidence exists but hasn't been tested with modern techniques. Cases that could potentially be solved if someone would just look at them again, with fresh eyes and new tools. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office has a dedicated cold case unit. They have detectives whose entire job is working these old cases, and that's not true everywhere. Many smaller agencies don't have the resources or the personnel to dedicate to cases that are decades old. They're focused on current investigations, current crimes, and the old cases just sit there gathering dust. But programs like the Bureau of Justice Assistance, grants that funded the DNA testing in Stephen's case, those programs make it possible for agencies without big budgets to still pursue justice in cold cases. And there are organizations like Othram Labs that are sometimes willing to do pro bono work or reduced cost work on cases that particularly need it. There's also been a cultural shift in how we think about cold cases. True crime podcasts and documentaries have made people more aware of these unsolved cases, more invested in seeing them solved, and sometimes that public pressure actually helps. Sometimes it keeps cases in the public consciousness, keeps pressure on law enforcement to keep investigating, keeps families from being forgotten. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office has a podcast called Unfinished Business that features cold cases, including Stephen Edenfield's case. And that podcast serves multiple purposes. It keeps the public informed. It generates tips from people who might have information. It shows families that the sheriff's office hasn't forgotten their loved ones. And it demonstrates transparency in the investigative process. When Sheriff Chronister stood up at that press conference and announced Brandon Gleeha's arrest, he made a point of acknowledging the pain the Edenfield family had endured, the 28 years of waiting, the family members who died without answers. And that acknowledgement matters. That recognition that the system failed this family for nearly 3 decades matters, because it shows a level of accountability and compassion that families of victims need to see. Looking at Brandon Gleeha's background raises questions about who he is, what led him to commit murder, whether Stephen Edenfield was his only victim, or whether there are other cases out there that might be connected to him. Because we know his DNA also matched that 2005 sexual assault case in Illinois, which means, at minimum, he's committed violent crimes against 2 different people in 2 different states years apart. And that pattern suggests someone capable of repeated violence, someone who doesn't learn from mistakes, someone who continues to hurt people. The fact that he was living in Tampa, possibly for years after Stephen's murder, possibly passing by the crime scene regularly, living a normal life while the Edenfield family suffered, that speaks to a certain kind of sociopathy, a certain lack of conscience, because most people would be haunted by having killed someone, would struggle with guilt or fear of being caught. But Brandon Gleeha apparently just went on with his life. Went to work, had relationships, did normal things, and maybe he thought about Stephen Edenfield sometimes, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he'd compartmentalized it, convinced himself it didn't matter, convinced himself he'd gotten away with it and would never face consequences. The confession is interesting because we don't know what prompted it. Whether the detective showed him the DNA evidence and he realized there was no point denying it. Whether he'd been carrying guilt all these years and felt some relief in finally admitting what he'd done. Whether he broke down under questioning, or whether he coldly calculated that confessing might get him a better plea deal. We simply don't know because the details of that interview haven't been made public. What we do know is that confessions in cold cases are relatively rare. Most suspects, when confronted with old evidence, either deny everything or lawyer up immediately. The fact that Brandon Gleeha confessed suggests either the evidence against him was so overwhelming he saw no point in denying it, or there was something else happening psychologically that made him want to admit it. And we may learn more about that when the case goes to trial and when defense attorneys start building their strategy and presenting their side of the story. There's also the question of what Brandon Gleeha has been doing for the past 28 years. Has he been committing other crimes that we don't know about yet? Has he hurt other people? Are there other jurisdictions that need to look at their unsolved cases and see if his DNA might match? Because often, when you catch someone who committed a violent crime decades ago, you find they haven't stopped. You find a trail of victims. And it's possible that catching Brandon Gleeha for Stephen Edenfield's murder might solve other cases too. For James Edenfield, the road ahead involves watching this case move through the court system, attending hearings, possibly testifying, definitely being present at the trial, and then, if there's a conviction, attending sentencing, and possibly giving a victim impact statement, where he can tell the judge and the jury and Brandon Gleeha directly what the past 28 years have been like, what it's meant to lose his brother, and then lose his mother and his sisters all while waiting for justice. What it's meant to be, the last survivor carrying this burden alone. Those victim impact statements are powerful moments in criminal cases. They're when families get to speak directly to the person who destroyed their lives. And whatever James chooses to say will be his opportunity to give voice to all the pain and anger and grief that's been building for nearly 3 decades. And then, after sentencing, after Brandon Gleeha is sent to prison, hopefully for the rest of his life, James will have to figure out how to move forward. Because getting justice doesn't erase the trauma, doesn't heal the wounds, doesn't bring back the people you lost. It just closes one chapter so you can maybe start writing a new one. And that's hard. That's a process that will take time. This case, this resolution, it matters not just for the Edenfield family, but for everyone who has a cold case in their family, everyone who's waiting for answers, everyone who thinks their case will never be solved. Because it proves that time doesn't run out on justice, that advances in science can reach back decades and catch people who thought they were safe, that dedication from law enforcement can keep cases alive until technology catches up, and that families shouldn't give up hope even when hope seems impossible. Stephen Edenfield's case is now the 39th cold case solved in Florida using Othram Labs technology, and it won't be the last. Right now there are detectives across Florida and across America pulling old evidence, submitting it for testing, waiting for results, building family trees, tracking down suspects, and somewhere there's another family about to get a knock on their door, just like James Edenfield got. About to hear the words, "We've made an arrest. We've solved it. You can finally have answers." And for those families, this case, Stephen's case, represents hope, represents proof that the system can work, that persistence pays off, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, and that word greed, written in blood on Stephen's wall, whatever it meant, whoever wrote it, it's now part of a solved case, part of a story that has an ending, part of a family's journey from tragedy to closure. And Brandon Gliha will spend the rest of his life knowing that he didn't get away with it after all, that eventually, inevitably, what goes around really does come around. Let's talk about what happens next in the legal process, because this story is far from over. Brandon Gliha's confession and arrest are just the beginning of what will likely be a long and complicated journey through the criminal justice system. The Hillsborough State Attorney's Office now has to build their case for trial. And even though they have a confession, even though they have DNA evidence, they can't take anything for granted because defense attorneys are skilled at creating doubt, at finding procedural errors, at challenging evidence, and the prosecution has to be prepared for every possible defense strategy. Brandon Gliha will be appointed a public defender or will hire his own attorney. And that attorney's job is to defend him vigorously, regardless of how guilty he appears. That's how the system works. Everyone gets a defense, and the attorney will start by reviewing every piece of evidence, every statement, every DNA test result, looking for any weakness they can exploit. They'll question whether the DNA was collected properly, whether the chain of custody was maintained, whether the confession was coerced, whether Brandon Gliha was read his rights, whether he had an attorney present during questioning, whether the detectives used any improper techniques, and if they find any procedural violations, they'll file motions to suppress evidence, to throw out the confession, to exclude the DNA, anything that might give their client a better chance at trial, or at least leverage for a plea deal. The prosecution knows all this. They've been preparing for it since the moment Brandon Gliha confessed. They've documented everything meticulously. They've made sure every step of the investigation followed proper protocols. They've preserved the chain of custody for all physical evidence. They've recorded the confession if possible. They've done everything by the book because they know this case is going to be scrutinized intensely given how old it is. Given the technology used to solve it, given the high-profile nature of a 28-year cold case finally being solved. There will be pre-trial hearings, probably many of them, where both sides argue about what evidence should be allowed at trial, where the judge makes rulings that could significantly impact the case. And these hearings could stretch out for months. It's entirely possible that the actual trial won't happen until late 2025, or even 2026. During this time, James Edenfield will have to be patient again, will have to wait again. Though this waiting is different from the waiting he's done for the past 28 years, because now there's momentum, now there's progress, now there's an endpoint visible on the horizon. He'll likely attend many of these hearings, will want to be present, will want to see Brandon Gleeher in person, will want the man who killed his brother to see him there in the courtroom, representing Stephen, representing their mother, representing their sisters who didn't live to see this day. The defense might try to negotiate a plea deal, might approach the prosecution and say, look, we'll plead guilty to second-degree murder instead of first-degree. We'll accept life in prison if you take the death penalty off the table. We'll save the state the expense of a trial and save the Edenfield family the trauma of a trial if you agree to certain terms. And the prosecution will have to decide whether to accept that kind of deal or whether to push for trial and push for the maximum penalty. James Edenfield will have input on that decision. Prosecutors typically consult with victims' families about plea deals, and James has already said publicly that he doesn't want the death penalty. He wants Brandon Gleeher to rot in prison, so if a plea deal offers life without parole, that might be acceptable to him. But if the prosecution believes they can get a conviction at trial for first-degree murder with all the evidence they have, they might decide to proceed to trial anyway. These are complex decisions with no perfect answers, because trials are risky, juries are unpredictable. Sometimes people who seem obviously guilty get acquitted because of jury nullification, or because one juror has reasonable doubt, or because the defense presents a compelling alternative theory. And prosecutors have to weigh the certainty of a plea deal against the uncertainty of a trial verdict. If the case does go to trial, it will be a major event in Tampa. The media will cover it extensively. The courtroom will be packed with reporters and true crime enthusiasts and members of the public who've been following the case. And James Edenfield will sit through every day of testimony, listening to forensic experts explain DNA evidence, listening to the medical examiner describe Stephen's injuries, listening to detectives describe the crime scene, seeing photographs of his brother's body, seeing that word greed written in blood on the wall, reliving the worst day of his life over and over again. The prosecution will call witnesses. They'll put the cold case detectives on the stand to explain how they solved the case. They'll bring in experts from Othram Labs to explain the genetic genealogy process. They'll bring in DNA analysts from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to confirm the matches. They'll build a timeline showing that Brandon Gleeher had opportunity and means. They'll introduce the confession, and they'll argue that this was premeditated murder committed during a robbery, which makes it first-degree murder under Florida law. The defense will cross-examine all these witnesses, will try to poke holes in the timeline, will question whether the DNA evidence is as conclusive as the prosecution claims, will argue that maybe the confession was coerced, or that Brandon Gleeher didn't understand his rights, or that he was mentally impaired during questioning. They'll do whatever they can to create reasonable doubt, and then the jury will deliberate. 12 people who didn't know Stephen Edenfield, who have no personal stake in this case except their duty as citizens, will go into a room and discuss the evidence and try to decide whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Brandon Gleeher committed first-degree murder, and their verdict will determine whether Brandon Gleeher spends life in prison, or whether he gets a lesser sentence, or whether in some unlikely scenario he's acquitted. For James Edenfield, those hours or days of jury deliberation will be excruciating, will be a different kind of waiting where he's powerless, where everything is in the hands of strangers, where he has to trust that the system will work, that the jury will see the evidence clearly, that justice will prevail, and when the verdict comes in, when the jury foreperson stands and reads guilty or not guilty, that moment will either validate 28 years of waiting or will shatter James completely. Most people following this case believe conviction is almost certain given the evidence. But we've all seen cases where juries surprise us, where someone who seemed obviously guilty gets acquitted, and nothing is guaranteed until that verdict is read. Let's talk about the broader impact of genealogy on law enforcement and on society. Because what happened in Stephen Edenfield's case is happening in cases all across America, and it's fundamentally changing how we think about cold cases, about unsolved murders, about the possibility of justice decades after a crime. Before genetic genealogy became available, if you had DNA from a crime scene but no match in CODIS, you were stuck. You had evidence but no way to use it. And cases would sit unsolved forever unless the perpetrator committed another crime and got entered into the system, or unless someone came forward with information. Now with genetic genealogy, you can take that DNA, upload it to public databases, find distant relatives of the perpetrator, build family trees, and potentially identify suspects who have no criminal record, who've never been arrested, who thought they were completely safe from detection. This technology has already solved hundreds of cases, the Golden State Killer being the most famous example, but there are so many others. Murders from the 70s and 80s and 90s that seemed unsolvable are suddenly getting solved. Families who had given up hope are getting answers, and this is fundamentally changing the psychology of committing serious crimes. Because now, criminals can't assume that avoiding arrest for a few years means they're safe. Now they have to worry that 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, science will advance enough to catch them. There are legitimate privacy concerns about this technology. Civil liberties advocates worry about law enforcement using DNA databases without proper oversight. Worry about false matches leading to innocent people being investigated. Worry about the slippery slope of genetic surveillance. And these are valid concerns that society needs to address through legislation and policy. But most people, when they hear about cases like Stephen Edenfield's, when they hear about families finally getting justice after decades, they support the use of genetic genealogy for solving serious violent crimes like murder and rape. They believe the public good outweighs the privacy concerns, especially since the databases being used are public databases where people have voluntarily uploaded their DNA, and many of those people actually want their DNA to be used to solve crimes. They see it as a way to contribute to public safety. Companies like Courtroom Labs are working with law enforcement agencies to develop best practices, to ensure the technology is used ethically, to maintain standards for how family trees are built and how suspects are identified. And there's increasing regulation and oversight to prevent abuse. The key is finding the right balance between using powerful investigative tools to solve crimes and protecting civil liberties. And that's an ongoing conversation that will continue as the technology evolves. For other families with cold cases, the Edenfield case represents hope but also frustration, because while the technology exists to potentially solve their cases, many law enforcement agencies don't have the resources to test old evidence, don't have cold case units with dedicated personnel, don't have access to the grants that fund genetic genealogy testing. There are thousands of families across America who are seeing cases like Stephen's get solved and asking, why not our case? Why isn't someone testing our evidence? Why can't we get the same advanced DNA analysis? And the answer often comes down to money and resources. Because testing costs $10,000 to $15,000 per case. And many sheriff's offices and police departments simply don't have that in their budgets, especially smaller rural agencies that are already stretched thin. Organizations like DNA Doe Project and Courtroom have done pro bono work on some cases. True crime podcasts and online communities have raised money through crowdfunding to pay for testing in specific cases. And there are federal and state grants available. But there's still a massive backlog of cold cases that could potentially be solved if only someone would test the evidence. This creates a kind of lottery system where some families get lucky. Their case gets selected for testing or gets publicity that leads to funding, while other equally deserving families continue waiting, and that inequity is troubling. That sense that justice depends on luck or resources rather than being equally available to everyone. The impact on the Tampa community and on the broader true crime community has been significant. People who've been following this case or who remember when Stephen Edenfield was murdered in 1997 are talking about it. discussing it online, sharing articles, and there's a sense of collective relief that this case has been solved, that someone is finally being held accountable. The Tampa Racket Club complex where Stephen lived and died. Residents there who remember that February morning when police cars and crime scene tape surrounded the building. They're probably talking about it again, remembering, maybe feeling vindicated that the case wasn't forgotten, that justice eventually came. And for people in the true crime community, the ones who listen to podcasts about unsolved cases, who watch documentaries about cold case investigations, who follow these stories obsessively, the Edenfield case is a reminder of why they're so invested in these stories. Because these aren't just puzzles to be solved. These are real families suffering real trauma. And when a case gets solved, it matters. It has real impact on real people's lives. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office podcast, Unfinished Business, featured Stephen's case. And listeners of that podcast are now seeing the resolution they hoped for, seeing that talking about cold cases publicly, keeping them in the public consciousness, really can make a difference in keeping investigative momentum going. Let's think about Stephen Edenfield's legacy, about how he'll be remembered now that his case is solved. For 28 years, his identity was frozen at age 41. He was the murder victim, the unsolved case, the tragic story. And his family has carried that weight, has been defined by this unsolved tragedy. But now, with Brandon Gleeha's arrest and confession, Stephen can be remembered as more than just a victim. He can be remembered as a person who was loved, who took care of his mother, who had dinner with his family the night before he died, who lived a life that mattered. And his death can be seen as something that justice eventually addressed, rather than something that the system failed to solve. His mother can be remembered not just as someone who died without answers, but as someone whose son's case eventually got solved, whose prayers were eventually answered even if she wasn't alive to see it. And there's something meaningful in that, in the idea that justice doesn't have an expiration date, that it can reach back through time and touch people who've already passed. James Edenfield can hopefully find some peace now, can hopefully sleep better knowing that he's not the only one carrying the burden anymore, that the criminal justice system is now carrying it, that Brandon Gleeha is behind bars and will likely never be free again. And while that doesn't erase the 28 years of suffering, it does provide an ending, a conclusion, a sense that the story is complete, even if it's a tragic story. The word greed, written on Stephen's wall, we may never know exactly what it means, unless Brandon Gleeha explains it at trial. But it's become a symbol of this case, a haunting detail that people remember. And now it's connected to a solved case, rather than an unsolved mystery. It's evidence that helped convict someone, rather than a cryptic message with no answer. Whatever Stephen meant if he wrote it, whatever Brandon Gleeha meant if he wrote it, that word has served its purpose. It's part of the narrative that led to justice. It's part of what makes this case memorable, part of what kept people interested and kept pressure on law enforcement to keep investigating. In the end, what matters most is that Stephen Edenfield's family finally has answers, finally has someone to hold accountable, finally has closure of a sort. And that 28 years after a brutal murder in a Tampa bedroom, justice has been served, delayed but not denied. And Brandon Gleeha will face the consequences of what he did on February 1st, 1997, when he followed Stephen home from wherever they'd been. When he walked through that door, Stephen opened for him. When he committed violence that took a life and shattered a family. And now, finally, after nearly 3 decades, he's being held accountable for it, and that accountability matters, that consequence matters, that demonstration that you cannot murder someone and escape justice forever matters, not just for the Edenfield family, but for all of us who believe that justice should be blind and eternal and unrelenting. This is the story of Stephen Edenfield, murdered at age 41 in Tampa, Florida, in February 1997. Whose case went cold for 28 years, until advances in DNA technology and dedicated cold case detectives finally identified his killer as Brandon Gleeha. who confessed and now faces trial for first-degree murder. It's the story of James Edenfield, who found his brother's body and spent 28 years praying for answers, who watched his mother and sisters die without knowing who killed Stephen, who is the last survivor bearing witness to justice finally being served. It's the story of how genetic genealogy is revolutionizing cold case investigation, how science can reach back decades to catch criminals who thought they'd escaped, how families who've given up hope can suddenly get the answers they've been waiting for. And it's a story that isn't over yet, because Brendan Gleeson still has to face trial. James Edenfield still has to walk through the legal process. Justice still has to run its course. But for the first time in 28 years, there's certainty rather than uncertainty. There's progress rather than stagnation. There's an ending in sight rather than endless waiting. And that means everything to a family that suffered in limbo for nearly 3 decades. The word greed may have been written in blood on Stephen's wall, but it's justice, finally. That's been written into the story of how he died and how his killer was caught. And that's a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth learning from. Because it shows us that time doesn't erase crime, that justice can be patient, and that sometimes, eventually, after years or decades of darkness, the truth comes to light and accountability arrives, and the families left behind can finally begin to heal. There's something we need to understand about the ripple effects of a murder that goes unsolved for 28 years. Because it's not just the immediate family that suffers, it's an entire community, an entire network of people whose lives intersect with the victim and the family. And those ripples extend outward in ways that are hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. Think about Stephen Edenfield's friends, the people he worked with, the neighbors who lived near him at the Tampa Racket Club complex. All of them experienced trauma when they learned what happened to him. All of them lived with fear that maybe the killer was still around. Maybe they were in danger too. Maybe this was random violence that could happen to anyone. The security guard who let both cars through that gate on the night of February 1st, 1997, who had no reason to suspect anything was wrong when Stephen said the person behind him was with him. That security guard has probably carried guilt for 28 years, wondering if there was something he should have noticed, some warning sign he missed, whether he could have prevented what happened if he'd just looked more carefully at the second driver, gotten a license plate number, asked more questions. That's an unfair burden for someone to carry, because there's no way he could have known what was about to happen. No way he could have predicted that letting that second car through would result in murder. But guilt doesn't operate on logic. Guilt operates on what-ifs and should-haves. And this man has probably replayed that moment thousands of times over the years. The neighbors who heard the violence at 1 a.m, who heard what might have been calls for help, who convinced themselves it was nothing and went back to sleep. They've carried their own guilt, wondering if Stephen would still be alive if they'd just called the police, if those extra minutes of response time would have made the difference between life and death. We live in a society where people are taught not to get involved, not to be nosy, not to overreact, and that cultural conditioning sometimes prevents people from taking action when action is desperately needed. And then, when something terrible happens, they're left wondering whether their inaction contributed to it. These neighbors have had to live with that question for 28 years. And now, with Brendan Gleeson's arrest, maybe they're experiencing relief that the killer has been caught, but also renewed guilt as they're forced to remember that night, to think about what might have been different if they'd acted differently. The detectives who worked the original investigation in 1997, who collected the evidence, who interviewed witnesses, who did everything they could with the tools available at that time, but still couldn't solve it. They've carried it too, because detectives take unsolved cases personally. They think about the victims, they think about the families. And when a case goes cold, it feels like failure, even though sometimes it's not about failure, but about the limitations of technology and circumstances. beyond anyone's control, when those original detectives heard that the case had been solved in 2025, that DNA and genetic genealogy had identified Brandon Gliha, that he'd confessed, they probably felt vindicated, felt that their work 28 years ago had mattered after all, because the evidence they collected so carefully, the blood samples they preserved, the documentation they maintained, that's what made the solution possible decades later. Without their diligence in 1997, there would have been nothing for the cold case unit to work with in 2022. No DNA to test, no evidence to analyze. So in a very real sense, the original investigators are part of this success story, even though they didn't get to see it solved during their active careers. Some of them are probably retired now, some might have passed away, but they all played a role in eventually bringing Brandon Gliha to justice. And that matters. That legacy of thorough police work that pays off decades later matters. The medical examiner who performed Stephen's autopsy in 1997, who documented every injury, who collected evidence from the body, who determined cause of death, that person's work is now part of a prosecution case, is now evidence that will be used in court to convict someone of murder. And there's professional satisfaction in knowing that the work you did so long ago is still relevant, still important, still serving justice. Let's talk about what this case means for other cold case families in Florida and beyond. Because right now, there are thousands of people watching the Edenfield case and wondering if their case could be next. If their loved one's murder could be solved using the same technology, if they could finally get the answers they've been waiting for. Some of these families have been waiting even longer than the Edenfields. 40 years, 50 years. Some have been waiting since the 1960s or 70s. And they're seeing cases from the 90s getting solved and thinking, why is mine taking so long? Why hasn't my evidence been tested? Why isn't there a cold case unit working on my family's tragedy? The answer is complicated and often frustrating because it involves budgets and priorities, and the reality that there are more cold cases than there are resources to investigate them. But each case that gets solved using genetic genealogy creates momentum for solving more cases, creates public awareness of what's possible, creates pressure on law enforcement agencies to dedicate more resources to cold case investigations. Organizations like the Vidocq Society and the Cold Case Foundation and the DNA Doe Project are working to keep cold cases in the public consciousness, to advocate for victims' families, to raise funds for DNA testing. And every solved case like Stephen's gives them ammunition to argue for more resources, more attention, more commitment to justice, regardless of how much time has passed. There's also the question of whether Brandon Gliha has other victims we don't know about yet. Because we know his DNA matched a 2005 sexual assault case in Illinois, which means there's at least one other person he victimized. And the pattern of violence spanning from 1997 to 2005 suggests someone who didn't stop, who continued hurting people, and there may be other cases in between or after that haven't been connected to him yet. Law enforcement agencies in Florida and Illinois and potentially other states are probably going through their unsolved cases right now, looking at murders and sexual assaults from the past 30 years, checking whether any of the DNA evidence might match Brandon Gliha, because sometimes when you catch someone for one crime, you discover they're responsible for multiple crimes. And solving one case can suddenly solve 3 or 4 or 5 others. The victims of those potential other crimes and their families deserve justice too, deserve to know that the person who hurt them has been caught. And Brandon Gliha's arrest may be the beginning of a much larger reckoning, a much broader accounting of damage done over decades. Investigators will be looking at his life history, where he lived, where he worked, who he associated with, whether there are any suspicious disappearances or unsolved murders in places where he spent time, building a comprehensive picture of his activities over the past 3 decades. The psychological profile of someone like Brandon Gliha is disturbing to consider. What kind of person commits a brutal murder, writes greed in the victim's blood on the wall, then goes on living a normal life for 28 years, gets arrested for an unrelated forgery charge, and when confronted with DNA evidence from a decades-old murder, simply confesses? There's a coldness to that, a lack of empathy and conscience that most people can't comprehend. And while we shouldn't spend too much time trying to humanize or understand someone who committed such violence, there is value in understanding the psychology of killers who successfully evade justice for long periods, because that understanding can help investigators recognize patterns, anticipate behaviors, develop better interrogation strategies. Brandon Gliha clearly believed he'd gotten away with Stephen's murder. 28 years is a long time to feel safe. To convince yourself that the evidence is gone or degraded or lost. To believe that even if the evidence exists, the technology will never advance enough to identify you. And that false sense of security is probably what made him sloppy, made him stay in Tampa where he committed the crime, made him continue committing crimes like that Illinois sexual assault, made him vulnerable to eventually being caught. The confession is particularly interesting from a psychological standpoint because hardened criminals usually don't confess. They lawyer up immediately. They deny everything, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. They make the prosecution prove every element of the case at trial. So why did Brandon Gliha confess? What was going through his mind during that interview with cold case detectives? Was it the weight of carrying the secret for 28 years? Was it recognition that the DNA evidence was irrefutable? Was it a calculation that confessing might get him a better deal? Was it some combination of all these factors? We may learn more about his mindset when the case goes to trial, when defense attorneys have to present some kind of narrative to explain his actions, when psychological evaluations are done, when his life history is examined in detail. There's also the question of remorse, whether Brandon Gliha feels any genuine regret for what he did to Stephen Edenfield, for the pain he caused the Edenfield family, or whether his confession was purely strategic, purely about self-preservation rather than conscience. James Edenfield will probably never get to ask Brandon Gliha directly why he killed Stephen, what happened that night. Whether Stephen said or did something that triggered the violence, or whether it was premeditated from the moment Brandon Gliha decided to follow Stephen home. And those unanswered questions will likely haunt James for the rest of his life, even with Brandon Gliha behind bars. Let's talk about the future of cold case investigation, because the technology that solved Stephen Edenfield's case is still evolving, still getting better, still becoming more accessible and more affordable. Companies like Othram are developing new techniques for extracting DNA from even more degraded samples, from smaller samples, from more challenging evidence. And they're working on ways to reduce the cost per case so that more law enforcement agencies can afford the testing. There are developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning that can help build family trees faster, can analyze genetic data more efficiently, can identify patterns that human genealogists might miss. And all of this means that cases that seem unsolvable today might be solvable in 5 or 10 years. The databases that genetic genealogists use are growing constantly as more people do ancestry DNA tests and upload their results, which means there are more potential matches, more family connections to trace, more pathways to identifying unknown suspects or victims. Some people are concerned about the privacy implications of this, about their genetic information being used by law enforcement without their explicit consent. But many others actively want their DNA to be available for this purpose, see it as a civic duty, as a way to contribute to solving crimes and bringing justice to victims. There's also movement toward creating better systems for tracking and prioritizing cold cases, for ensuring that evidence is preserved properly, for maintaining contact with victims' families, for providing regular updates on case status, even when there's no new developments. Too many families of cold case victims feel abandoned by the system, feel like once a case goes cold, it's completely forgotten. And that sense of abandonment compounds their trauma, makes them feel like their loved one didn't matter enough to keep investigating. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office podcast, Unfinished Business, is one model for how agencies can maintain connections with cold case families, can keep cases in the public eye, can demonstrate ongoing commitment to finding answers. And other law enforcement agencies around the country are developing similar approaches, using social media, podcasts, websites, press conferences, anything that keeps cold cases visible and active rather than filed away and forgotten. Some states are passing laws requiring periodic review of cold cases, requiring agencies to test old DNA evidence using modern techniques, requiring notification to families when cases are reopened or when new developments occur. And these legislative efforts are important for ensuring that cold case investigation is taken seriously, is properly funded, is given the priority it deserves. The Edenfield case will likely become a teaching case, something that's studied in criminal justice programs, something that's featured in true crime documentaries and books, something that demonstrates both the power of modern forensic technology and the importance of evidence preservation and persistent investigation. Future detectives and forensic scientists will learn about how this case was solved, will understand the techniques that were used, will see the value of never giving up on a case no matter how much time passes. Stephen Edenfield's name will be remembered not just as a victim, but as part of a story about justice prevailing, about science and dedication and family love combining to solve what seemed unsolvable. And that's a better legacy than being an unsolved mystery, than being a cold case file gathering dust in some evidence room. For James Edenfield, the coming months and years will involve seeing this case through to its conclusion, attending court proceedings, possibly testifying, definitely being present when Brandon Gliha is sentenced, and then beginning the difficult process of moving forward with his life, knowing that this chapter is finally closed. He's 72 years old now. He spent nearly half his life waiting for this moment. And now that it's here, he has to figure out what comes next. How to live without the constant weight of unanswered questions. How to honor his brother's memory, and his mother's memory, and his sister's memories, in ways that aren't defined by tragedy and injustice. Maybe he'll become an advocate for other cold case families. Maybe he'll work with organizations that support victims' families. Maybe he'll simply try to find peace in his remaining years, knowing that he fulfilled his promise to keep fighting for Stephen, that he never gave up, that he lived to see justice done. Whatever he chooses, he's earned the right to make that choice, earned the right to close this chapter and start writing new ones, earned the right to remember Stephen as his brother rather than as an unsolved murder victim. And that shift, that transformation from victim to person who was loved, that matters enormously. The word greed on Stephen's wall is no longer a mystery. It's evidence in a solved case, and soon it will be evidence in a conviction. And then it will be just a tragic detail in a closed file. And Stephen Edenfield can rest, knowing that his killer didn't escape, that justice took 28 years, but it arrived, that his family never stopped fighting for him, and that in the end, finally and definitively and irrevocably, Brendan Gliha was held accountable for taking his life on that terrible night in February 1997, when violence came through an unlocked door and changed everything forever, but couldn't ultimately prevent justice from following 28 years later with DNA evidence and genetic genealogy and dedicated detectives and a confession and a family that refused to forget. And that's the story. That's what matters. That's what we remember. That justice delayed is not justice denied. That families deserve answers no matter how long it takes. And that sometimes, against all odds, the system works. The science evolves, the truth emerges, and the people who commit terrible crimes discover that time is not their friend, that evidence doesn't disappear, that guilt has a long memory, and that eventually, inevitably, what they've done will catch up with them and they'll face the consequences. Just like Brandon Gliha is facing them now, 28 years later, but facing them nonetheless. And that has to count for something, has to mean something. has to matter to every family still waiting for their own moment of justice. Their own knock on the door with news that their case has been solved, their own chance to finally breathe and know that their loved one has not been forgotten. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.